Ready for tech that reflects the global world? Welcome to our podcast, The Global Code. We go beyond the buzzwords to explore real world tech solutions for and with everybody everywhere in the age of AI. I'm your host, Dr. Salima Bhimani, Maven of Moonshots. And here are my co hosts, Dr. Shadan Deleveaux, G Force of Talent, and Ashish Pujari, the Master of Engineers. Today we have with us Sneha Deo. Woo woo! I would like to call her a triple threat because you're about to find out why. She is a Los Angeles-based technologist, artist, and activist. That's like a powerful three combination, by the way. She currently leads AI product and research at Microsoft, building the next generation of responsible products and policies for emergent technologies. Outside of this role, Sneha is a composer, a sound designer, and a maker of games, and a committed community organizer working at the intersection of disability justice, digital rights, and labor movements. I love your bio. I was just telling you that earlier. Seriously.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you.
We are super excited. Okay, I know Shadan was like ready to ask you some fun fact. Come on, Shadan, you got to do it. You got to ask her.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just super curious. All right. It's something that we ask most of our guests, all of our guests, if we would remember, but definitely most of them. If you had to share a couple of one or two fun facts, what would it be, Sneha?
Yeah, I think a big fun fact about me lately is I'm a huge fan of the Muppets and puppetry in general. And because I work in the gaming space, I think my top of mind fun fact is that I believe that Twitch streamers and puppetry have a lot in common. There's something very cool about having a little bit of a character that you play. But that is also like selling this idea of authenticity that I think can be observed in a lot of like old school puppetry. And I think it's a really great way to like build connection across digital spaces. So this is a little bit of a idea that I've been stewing on, and have been a huge fan of puppets and Twitch streams, and I'm starting to see the connection there.
I've never heard those two things brought together in quite that way. So I'm already in awe. I'll say I actually love the Muppets in general. I'll never forget. I went with my family and my nephew to Disney World, and they have this Muppet exhibit almost, where you can go to a theater and watch, see the Muppets, and then they have this outdoor theater where they start talking to each other. And he was maybe 8 or 9 years old, where he thinks he's too cool for stuff. He's like, I know they're just, animatronics or machines. But when they started talking and engaging, he was completely enraptured, right? Like it was just magical to see it all happen. And so I completely get it. And I was right there with him. So we are aligned.
That is so cool. Yeah, I think it's so cool to see something that's like so abstracted away and like simplified still feel so real. And like, it can't make facial expressions, but you're like, I get it. I get what it's emoting, right? Like, I think it's such a cool performance art.
Love it.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Well, you have this incredible intersection of interests and background, technologist, artist, and activist. And so before we jump into like the responsible AI questions, I just wanted to ask, like, how did you come to this work, given that you have this incredible background?
Yeah. When I look back on it, I feel really lucky. I think I came to this work through the sort of confluence of a lot of different elements of my life coming together. So I think the first thing that I sort of want to call out that has been really important in my life is that I was always encouraged to pursue the kinds of things that I wanted to do with a level of seriousness and love. I was encouraged to pursue music throughout my childhood, which has always been one of my primary art forms and forms of expression, but was supported to take that really seriously, as seriously as I wanted, by a wonderful family. And I was similarly supported in pursuing my academic interests. So I was one of those kids who really loved math and science. My dad used to tell me bedtime stories around science history, which I think really humanized the process of science for me. They were associated with histories, with people, with discovery, and not just sort of kept in this bubble of like the numbers and the pure math of it all. Um, and then also just the conditions of my life sort of brought me here as well. So um, I would really say it started for me in undergrad. I studied a dual degree in music and in computer science um, because of the interest that I had had and that had been fostered in my K through 12 life. But it was also the first time I was living away from home. And at around the same time, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness and started to a regimen of treatment that made me feel very, very sick all the time while I was in undergrad. And as I was trying to continue to pursue my passions, I really needed a lot of support, and I turned to a community of other disabled and chronically ill students, and found a lot of real care there that allowed me to continue to pursue these passions with the kind of support that I had grown up with.
Mhm.
And in that community, started to realize that I wasn't just receiving care through like individual actions, right? Someone who would hold my hand when I was taking an injection, or go run and get me food when I was feeling really, really unwell. It was also that this community was advocating for different kinds of policies on my campus that allowed me to be accommodated in my classroom, that they were advocating for fair housing for other students who needed their access needs met in their residential spaces, that they were taking it outside to the city of LA and advocating for disability justice policies across our city, even outside of our like sort of bubble of undergrad life. And I started to see the connection between the care that I was receiving as an individual and what advocacy work can do in terms of care for a much broader community. Um, and I'm really grateful that I got to experience that in undergrad, because it meant that I was able to complete my computer science degree and a music degree and not have to compromise on those things even when I was very sick. But also, it started a lifelong commitment to community organizing, and a prioritization of that through my adult life. So as I left undergrad and started a career as a baby computer scientist, as an engineer, I also found opportunities in a new city that I was living in to work with the League of Women Voters, creating public policy resources in many languages at an accessible reading level and distributing them in community spaces, and understanding that that's a way of showing care for a community that I'm in, that education and making resources available to folks is a way of showing care, um, and have kept that with me my whole life. And being able to do both of those things throughout my career is really what I would say led me to this intersection now of getting to work on responsible tech full time in my day job, right? A lot of it is thinking about, how do policies impact people? What kind of advocacy is needed to actually optimize tech for humans, right? How do we bring people in so they can engage and advocate for themselves, right? Even in an area where maybe the tech is changing fast and is incredibly complicated, how do we get people the resources so that they can understand and decide for themselves how they want to engage and what they want their rights to be? Um, that's the work that I was doing as a community organizer, my whole journey with that. And then being able to also marry that to the passion I've always had for the human side of math and science has been an incredible sort of like thing to look back on and reflect on, rather than something that I had necessarily designed or planned. But it does feel right that it led me here.
You really center like human beings and their needs and their care, and their sort of ability to live a full, whole life. Like that's what I'm hearing. And I love how you can then take all of that and map it onto how does that inform how I think about responsible AI as an example and responsible technology. Can you give us like a sort of you're already doing it, but maybe a more sort of succinct definition of how you would define responsible AI or responsible technology?
Yeah, for sure. Um, Well, I think there's a couple of things at play here, right? When I think about responsibility, it's about a commitment or an agreement um, to someone else, right? Responsibility is not about like what one person decides is like the right thing to do, right? Like when we think about responsibility, it is sort of centered on this idea of care for another who is not you and who is maybe outside of your experience. And I think at its best, it's care for all others, right? Like I think that's really where we should be pushing ourselves to get to with this concept of responsible anything, right? Um, and then thinking about the element of tech and AI, well, I don't think we should just be restricting it to AI, but when I think about AI, I think about like any sort of application in the broadest sense, any sort of application of data for decision making, right? Like when we think about intelligence, a lot of it is around like supporting decision making or changing behaviors, right? Or the thinking and logic that goes into that. So when we think about artificial intelligence, it's taking data, patterns from data, and using that to help inform decisions. And so when we think about the responsibility there, it's how do you think about like both the inputs and the outcomes of those decisions and making sure those are actually aligned to what it is that a public needs, what it is that a public wants, and sort of decentering who we might assume is the most important segment of that public. Thinking about it broadly and thinking about the areas where folks might be feeling different kinds of pain more deeply, right? We can't sort of ignore that there are differences within that population of the large public. Yeah. So I don't know if that was succinct, but I guess what I would say is, yeah, I'm sort of like working it out on the podcast. But I think for me, how I think about it is like centering the needs and perspectives of a broad public as we're designing and implementing technology.
Thanks, Sneha, for that definition. So can you walk us through like what you're working on and how your day-to-day looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now I work on responsible AI for one of Microsoft's 4 product areas. The area that I focus on is our productivity tools. So that's Windows, that's Microsoft Office, what we now call M365. And it includes our sort of flagship generative AI product, which is M365 Copilot. It's a set of tools embedded within M365's product suite that supports and augments human productivity. Yeah, so that's the focus of my scope, and in terms of thinking about how we bring responsible AI to it, I sit within this really fun and cool team called the Office of Applied Research, whose mission is really to take areas where there's a ton of new knowledge developing out of academia, out of policy research, in my case as well, right? And bring that new knowledge into what's actually getting built and what's actually going to be in the hands of users as soon as possible, right? So a lot of what I do is figuring out, hey, what are we learning? What's the best we can do around responsible AI? What's getting published, right? And where do we sort of think this policy and regulatory landscape is going to go? And what does that reflect about what the public actually wants? And figuring out, okay, now how do we translate that into product strategy, into tools that allow these products to get built in a responsible way faster, right? Thinking about measurements, thinking about marketing, right? Like the whole story around how our products get built and positioned based on what's coming out of research. And that's sort of my day-to-day.
Oh, cool. All right. So if we can just get a little bit more granular, if you can just give us a few examples in terms of what you're seeing on the ground, that connects to this larger idea of responsibility and accessibility. Can you help us or walk us through some examples?
Sure, like an example of a like piece of work that we've got to do, or like
Yeah, without breaking any confidentiality, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I think there's a couple of areas where let me ask a scoping question back to you, sort of. There's a couple of areas where we see some really interesting examples. One of them, I would say, is the area of sort of measurements around responsibility and fairness in particular is evolving very quickly. That's an area where research is being published every day, and also novel approaches are being novel metrics even, right, are being developed every day. One of the sort of key examples here is then like, how do you make that super productizable, right? Like, how do you get those things adopted across a large suite of products like M365 Copilot, right? So that could be an example we dive into. Another example we might think of, yeah, fairness is a really good one. Another example we might think of is like building large language models across non-English languages. I know Salima and I were talking about that. That might be another example to hop into. What seems most, I don't know, most intriguing.
Both are intriguing, but let's do the first one in
Sure.
terms of metrics around responsible AI.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think this is a good example. It's a good example because metrics are useful when they measure what matters to people. But in the land of responsible AI, w- that is really developing very quickly, right? Like what people care about, what matters, is one, very subjective, and two, very fluid, right? Like it's not uniform across cultures. It's not uniform even within a region. Let's say what everyone thinks and feels, as we know, and so it's one of those areas that I think is very fun and cool because yes, we have folks who are thinking about this in sort of like the pure data side of things. Um, but we're also having to think about it from this perspective of how are humans thinking about it, right? So we work with this sort of really cool team that's a mix of sociologists, of anthropologists, of economists, even, right? Thinking about like fairness and in labor dynamics. And then they'll do a bunch of research, right? Publish something, and also share findings with us. And typically, what those findings look like that is most useful and applicable to engineering is there like a new understanding or taxonomy of like how we can think about potential harms that could be impacting our users, right? So that really helps folks get to this structured place of like, okay, what's on the table for potential risks associated with not doing the right or responsible thing. And once we're able to determine those kinds of taxonomies, then it becomes much easier to understand, okay, what are the metrics that we might associate with doing a good job or doing a bad job against these kinds of harms? And how do we really prove out that those connections exist, right? So a lot of it is like create like a high level OKR, and then maybe you'll have like sub OKRs below it, right? That can you make a hypothesis of like, oh, it'll move the needle here, right? It's basic sort of product management that I think most folks are pretty familiar with, but it's sort of this additional element of centering user experience in a really specific way, right? Like thinking about how a really broad set of users might experience things in ways that are unequal, right? Or that might have outcomes that are unfair, right? So a lot of it is also thinking about like, what are the things that we're not measuring today and not seeing today. So we take that new knowledge, right? And then that becomes something that's pretty clear for engineers to be able to implement, right? Like they're used to the language of metrics, they're used to the language of measuring performance. And being able to sort of demonstrate differences when you implement something one way versus implement it another allows for them to then be able to like really experiment on that. And then once those experiments are done, we sort of figure out like, okay, how do we make this scalable then, right? So if there are learnings that are coming out from how we might influence those metrics, then we're able to sort of apply those more broadly or turn them into tools so that they're really easy to adopt or are sort of baked into the product pipeline within our productivity tools. And I'm sorry to keep it a little bit vague, but just want to, be mindful of what's okay to sharing with.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I like what you were saying earlier, just with respect to responsible AI being really almost in agreement and the commitment amongst, just groups of folks. And so given that, what you were saying just about that and thinking about the multiple perspectives and inputs and outputs, how do you then take into account, what does it look like taking into account the various regions of people that are impacted just kind of globally, right? As we think about just, the name of this podcast is, just the global code, for example, a lot of times we'll see perspectives that are very, of course, US centric and things like that, or even EMEA, but thinking more broadly about like the global South and things like that, just how do you take into account all of the various perspectives and what are the implications there?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think what is important here is talking about why. I think it can be there. I think there are real blockers right now to centering the global South, or to even decentering, right? Like the US and the West, in particular, around large language models, which is my focus, I will say, just given the Microsoft's positioning right now. The big ones that really stand out to me are one, the cost of running large language models is incredibly, incredibly high. So who has access to this technology, even from the jump, right? What does it cost to be able to build something with large language models and to be able to experiment with it, especially, right? Like to experiment with it before you have to be able to sell it and pay for it, right? Allows you all this privilege and freedom as an organization to like figure out your use case, right? But it's costly, right? Like there's a reason why you see the big tech companies are able to sort of, fund exploration here. So that's one thing that I want to sort of call out. It's a technology that's expensive to run, and that means it's kind of hard to democratize, right? Which is a word that I think technologists like to toss around a lot. But if you're really thinking about democratization, especially at like a global scale, you have to think about how accessible is it for a technology to be experimented with, to be played with before there's a sellable use case, right? To get funding to work on those sorts of things. We know that there's already an existing funding gap between the US and between the West and the rest of the world. So that's one thing I want to call out. Thing two, particularly around large language models, is we see just the data in for English is massively outsized compared to what exists for any other language, right? Even thinking about non-Western English dialects, right? Like, it's just the kind of data that we have for US English is next level, and it is what powers the sort of like cool and magical experiences that I think gets people excited about generative AI. And the data exists for other languages, some of them, right? But if you think about like just in India, for example, 2/3 of the population lives in rural parts of India and probably speaks very different dialects, right? And are those dialects captured in any meaningful way in data that could be used, right? Like, so that's 2/3 of a billion-person population who may never have access to a generative AI model that's really going to work with them in their languages. We see similar issues in, or not issues, right? But like lack of data for indigenous languages in South America or dialects of Spanish there, or similarly across Africa, Although I will take a moment to plug a really cool nonprofit called Masakane, which my colleagues work on, that is a project for community development of language resources for African languages by and for researchers and anthropologists based in Africa. And the work they're doing is really amazing. I think it also unlocks a huge amount of knowledge in terms of nonprofit process for how to do this for other regions where it's going to be important, right? And you think about the populations that both have the opportunity to be left behind if we don't invest in building out data for languages here, but also that increase by so much, right? The potential for emergent technologies that run on language data, right? You think about the number of languages spoken in just China and India, right? And that accounts for a 2 billion person increase in the total addressable market for a large language models, right? To me, that feels like a huge blocker, but also a huge opportunity for recentering in a really impactful way this particular single example of one kind of AI, but one kind of AI that I think there's a lot of interest and excitement about in the U.S., but that I think is something that could do some really magical stuff outside of the U.S. If we lay the right groundwork, right? To me, I think really magic happens when people get to self-advocate and build for themselves, right? And those two blockers, that cost issue and the language issue, right now mean that people who speak English and live in the US and work at big, well-funded tech companies are the ones who get to decide what gets built. And I think addressing that is really the first step here to being able to recenter or decenter the US and put the power in a more broader audience's hands.
No, I think you've done just a great job of highlighting both almost the danger and the opportunity of where we are. Right. And on one hand, like you say, just the real challenges around cost and access and things like that, but also the real opportunity of the new perspectives that can be unlocked and accessed if this is approached the right way. And I think that that's incredibly exciting, at least to me. And so we'll love to hear about the nonprofit that you mentioned that are helping to create some of those pathways to allow things like that to happen. Salima, I feel like I see you leaning in for a question. I feel it burning.
No, because I was feeling your excitement and your energy around everything that Sneha just shared. And I was thinking about this as you were talking, Sneha, and I thought, so actually AI could in fact be a catalyst for things that we haven't addressed for a long time. Because the reality is that we haven't addressed data inequity in real terms globally for a very long time, right? We've built tech in Silicon Valley primarily, with data that, we all have access to that represents, a very small swath of the world, right? And yet I think given AI's real, sort of huge global implications of using this technology, I almost feel like it's catalyzing something, potentially catalyzing a change, a dynamic, could catalyze a dynamic change that we haven't really seen in the way that we would want, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see that for sure.
Me too.
Yeah, and I think it raises another really interesting point, which is sort of about the value that's being generated or claimed to be generated by AI and by emergent tech in general. Like, one of the things that I think is sort of like a common buzz phrase is AI is going to generate massive amounts of value, right? It's going to for the people who are building it, right? And so what I kind of wonder is one, we hear a lot, and I would be remiss not to acknowledge we hear a lot about the undervaluation of data labor that feeds this model that's going to generate a lot of value. And that's a concern, I think, particularly for the global South, right? We see a lot of data workers who are undercompensated, especially given that there's this conversation around like how much value is going to be generated out of these magic models. And two, it raises like, how are we going to distribute the value that's generated out of these models? Does it just make people in Silicon Valley or in, New York, not to pick on the city, richer, right? Or is it something that helps us think about, hey, like as a species, we have a ton of resources. How do we distribute it in a way that raises the standard of living for everybody, that raises the standard of healthcare for everybody, that raises or addresses food distribution, for example, or natural resource distribution in a way that actually meaningfully improves people's quality of life and duration of life, right? That to me feels like a really important question. And if there is going to sort of be this catalyzing force from AI, I think that's part of the discussion here, right?
Yeah.
I think that, a lot of it has to do with like how we distribute the value here.
So, Sneha, I feel like you're talking about value I think in a very humanistic way, which I love. There's a underlying sort of idea that social equity is something, and economic equity, and like is very, very important, right? Foundational. How is that aligned with how a lot of people are thinking about value, or like how are other people thinking about the value of artificial intelligence? Like I'm still trying to make sense of that myself.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. The one that I always go back to, and I think this is because I work in a productivity context, is like, what does it free up people to do? But on the other side of it, what does it do to like a human labor market, right? Like, so I'm an artist. I live in LA. I was around here during the WGA strikes last summer. And one of the big points of contention between the Writers Guild of America and the studios that typically employ them is what does it mean when AI can produce written scripts in terms of what humans should be paid to write scripts? And I think that is a great example of some of the very real concerns that people feel around AI. My perspective on it is when I sort of think about, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but I promise I'll bring it back to value. I think what is interesting here is there's stuff people don't want to spend their time doing, but that people have to do. And there's stuff that people want to do anyway, and they don't do it because they're getting paid well for it necessarily. They maybe never did it because it was part of being paid. We see, cave paintings from a time when it was hard to survive as humans, right? But people wanted to make art. They wanted to tell stories. It feels good to do that. I think it's a part of being alive and being human that is not necessarily associated with survival. But that, we have set up our world in such a way that being productive or being valued for your labor, right, is the way you survive, right? That's the way you can support and a life truly. So when I think about value, right, that's generated from AI, I think my ideal is it is improving people's lives by reducing the crummy stuff, right? Like, but it also has to not undercut what they need to survive, right? And so if we're living in a world where it takes away work for people or it undervalues the work that they want to do to be able to support themselves, support their families, support their loved ones and their communities, right? Then I don't think we're succeeding, right? And to me, I think like that's the sort of question of like value distribution here is what are all the outputs that are good from AI, right? Or from any emergent technology? And how do we actually make sure that it's really and truly like improving people's lives, not threatening them, right? Not creating more anxiety about like, how am I going to get my next paycheck? Or, oh man, like now I'm replaced by a robot and I don't get to, have health insurance as a result of that, right? Like that's terrible. So that's sort of how I think about value a little bit more holistically, which I know I don't know if that matches other people's perspectives, but I know there are others who are much smarter economic minds who are thinking about this for sure. And that is a comfort to me for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Tia. Yeah, that's pretty insightful. But I would like to like go back to the cost aspect of things. So you did mention that it's pretty expensive to, train these models and run them. And then, for a long time, I would say what it reminds me of is like space tech, right? For a long time, you could only, if you wanted satellites, you had to come to the US, you had to go to Russia, and they were like pretty expensive. But then finally, I guess after a couple of decades, like India was able to do it, and they were able to send a uh, moon probe for like less than the cost of a Hollywood film, right? So, um, so so in terms of like cost, um, like I would like to understand where this cost originates from, because in my head, a model is just like a piece of software which lives on storage, right? And then data is also a piece of bits which is on storage. So where is the cost aspect coming from? Number one, which is purely monetary in perspective. And
Mhm.
are we paying a cost in terms of energy consumption where it's like impacting, I don't know, sustainability goals?
100%. Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that. Um, Yeah, so where the cost comes from, to keep it really, really simple, right, is like it's a huge amount of data that needs to be processed, right? To get these results of let's say like GPT models, for example, to get them fast, which is part, I think, of the appeal of this technology is that it feels like talking to someone, right? Um, it's it's processing the input very quickly. It's also um, the cost of training on like, the entire content of the World Wide Web or whatever is also pretty significant in terms of, especially for English, as we discussed, it's a high resource language and it's training on a ton of data. Um, Primarily that's the cost, and also the thing there is that, there's very nice fancy new chips that allow for this to exist. Those are pretty expensive to buy, they're expensive to run. And you're totally right that there's a massive energy cost associated with it too, right? Like there's a ton of studies talking about like energetic cost and water usage and what it means in terms of, both who gets to run these models. It kind of comes back to this balance of value and who is likely to get impacted by the burden of what these contributions to climate change are, right? So I think it's a really great call out again to think about, you can spend money and not really deal with the consequences of that cost if you live in an ice bubble, or, you get to travel to the moon because you can afford to do that and escape this planet, right? Like, I think those things are totally connected. So, yeah, it's a great point. I think the energetic cost is something um, that I find incredibly concerning. And I don't know that I've seen a good proposed solution here.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you kind of say is if people can maybe wait for their results for instead of them being instant, maybe it comes in like, I don't know, 20 seconds. And if they, anyways, these days, I mean, most of the results are pretty accurate, but somewhat not accurate at the same time today. So if people are willing to take the results with a grain of salt, are we saying we can somewhat reduce the cost here?
Maybe. I think that could be part of it. I think, to me, the more significant part of it is, are we using this technology to solve the right problems? Or is there just so much buzz and hype around it that the solutions that maybe aren't even relevant here, right, are getting funded and then, eating up some of this, this cost we all share, which is the environment, right? Like that we can't, it's a resource that, we need to preserve. So that almost feels more pressing to me, is understanding like what are the use cases. And I think we're not quite there yet, actually, right? Of what are the use cases for large language models and generative AI that are where the cost is worth it, right? It's about sort of ROI here, right? To me, we have these massive unsolved human scale, world scale, right? Like all life on Earth scale problems that are yet unsolved. Things like, I think food distribution is one of my favorite examples here, because I think people feel it, right? You feel hungry every day. And it's nice to be able to have access to food, but it's not the reality for all people. If we have problems like that that could be solved through AI, right? Like, then maybe the cost is worth it in that scenario, right? But I'm not sure that I would say, one of the things that I see often is, because I'm in the gaming community here in LA, folks are talking about like, what are the applications of AI to video game development, for example. I don't know that the cost there is something that's justifiable, right? So to me, it's more, how do we actually get really specific about the use cases, and understanding like building shared collective beliefs around ROI, right? And what ROI can and should mean for everybody, not just for an investor who'd like to make a big chunk of change.
I see that we are coming up close to the end of the podcast, but I just couldn't let you go without asking you. So one of the things that you are on alerts for are, again, just that balance between economics and trade-offs. It seems like you're just at the forefront, taking a look at the research and seeing what's going on just on the ground. What has you excited?
Yeah. What has me excited is, one, I think some of what we've already talked about around some of the very real community efforts to improve and address access to emergent technologies across the global South. I'll plug Masakane again, but there's also a ton of work being done in Latin America around like accessing tech, accessing large language models. They tend to perform pretty well in Spanish. So like advances there, right? Like I think are really exciting. And it's bringing some amount of awareness to data labor that has been existing, right, for a long time, and making sure that I think that there's starting to be a push around ensuring that data labor is compensated fairly, especially as it generates a ton of value here. I'll plug quickly. There's a data workers inquiry that is going on right now and has just started to release results through DARE, the Distributed Autonomous Institute for Research. which is a really great organization that does a ton of really interesting cross-disciplinary research around issues of emergent technology and data. I think the other thing that has me really excited here is I think that, since the pandemic, people have started to realize that digital spaces are public spaces and we deserve to have rights. All of us deserve a seat at the table in a discussion of rights in public spaces. And that also includes how we want to engage with each other and with technology on digital spaces. So I think the more that people are able to sort of think about it and advocate for themselves and feel comfortable doing that, the better tech is going to get. I think one of the big problems is that folks are designing without an ear to the ground, but the louder the voice of the public, the harder that is to ignore, right? So as we can sort of empower folks to feel enfranchised in this space, and I think as folks are taking it upon themselves to participate in the way tech gets built and regulated, I see a better future for technology in general to really reflect what it is that people need and what it is that people want, because I think we deserve both.
Neha, you've given us, oh my gosh, so much to think about, so much to chew on. I feel like you've given all of us homework. I don't know that you meant to do that, but I think you did. I think basically what you've said is uh, technologists, general public, everyone out there, really think about what this technology needs to do for us as a human, as humankind, and how are we going to invest in the right things so that we are getting the value out of it, as you were talking about, and maybe even solving some really hard problems that have been very hard to solve for a very long time, right? Maybe it's going to be the thing that helps us unlock certain things, um, and change the trajectory for humanity. So I am inspired actually by listening to you, and your vision really for what this technology could do if, again, we have that groundwork and those foundational pieces there, and we have a collective conversation about where to focus that energy and what to use it for. So thank you so much for giving us all of that and more, and like I said, getting us to walk away with really thinking about our role in all of this.
Thank you guys so much for the conversation and for creating this platform. It's so cool, and I am so grateful that these conversations are happening and continuing.
Excellent. Well, we are
Yeah.
excited by having you on again at some point, if we can. And in the meantime, thank you again, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Thank you guys
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Hey, all, welcome to the jam session. All right, let's jam. So, Ashish, Shadan, thoughts?
Shadan, go for it.
What a great conversation. I think that the points that Sneha was making just around making sure that, or one, establishing that responsible AI is really just an agreement between multiple parties and whose perspectives are we actually getting is huge. And then that second point that she made around, you know, thinking about the trade-offs. And so what are the worthwhile use cases? Right. And then how do we focus on those? To me, again, something I had never really thought of, but it was great to just hear her kind of share her thoughts on that. So that was one of my biggest takeaways.
Hmm.
How about you two?
Ashish,
Um,
thoughts?
yeah. So for me, yeah, same thing. I would say I really wanted to understand the cost side of things here. So that was pretty enlightening. And I have to say, like, I guess Neha was one of the most inspirational guests that we have had thus far in terms of her background and what she's doing and what there are like so many things that she has done already. So, but apart from that, yeah, the cost side of things was like really interesting, and it sounded like, oh, it's so costly. Only the US can do it. Like that's what I didn't want to hear, and it sounds like cost is high because it has been kept high, and not really because it should be high. So I feel like that's good because, once cost can be figured out, then it becomes more accessible, right? I'm more optimistic on that sense, coming from the podcast.
Mm, yeah. I felt like I walked away feeling like it's building on both of your points. Like, I felt like she left us with like grapple with all this, people. Like, kind of like here it all. Here's the messy, really interesting, exciting, but like serious challenges that are ahead of us, right? And we need to be actively grappling with very important questions around like, why do we need this and what do we need it for and how are we going to build it, and are we ensuring that we're building it for the right things and that it's not going to cost humans anything, and it's not going to cost us badly in a way that's going to sort of be detrimental to us, or to the environment. So I feel like she was really she's almost a philosopher, I would say, at the same time as she is a scientist, as she is an artist. Like, she was really laying sort of a vision, I think. That's what I walked away with. She has a vision for what this technology could be and could do. And I think what she was saying to all of us is she was challenging us to say, we need to bring this back to what matters the most, and what matters the most may not be the same for all of us. And so then we need to get into the room and talk about that. And I really, really appreciated that, because I just feel like she laid it out in a way that even challenged me to say, right, like, yes, there is this sort of, it feels sometimes like there's this like kind of like a general integration of AI into everything. And one, I don't know that that's true. And two, it shouldn't be true. And that's the thing that I think got me invigorated, quite frankly.
It was very much a call to action for folks to get engaged, get involved, weigh in, participate, and then help to decide what this all looks like. And so, to your point, I feel very challenged.
Yeah.
to decide.
And I would like to say, it's not the time to be on the sidelines, because, this reminds me of, what my parents used to tell me when the computer was introduced, right? So they used to work for like banks in India, and before computers, there were like typewriters, right? So we are in that stage where I feel like Gen AI or AI in general is that next step, right?
Yeah.
And your willingness to participate or not participate is not going to change anything. So it's better to be involved and make your requirements known, rather than just saying, hey, I don't want to be involved and I want this to fail or whatever, right? So that's not going to work, and you have to be involved.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, though, that's something about Sneha's background that's so interesting, is that she is an advocate, right? She's somebody who's worked in the world of advocacy and kind of knows how to channel energy of the public, with large scale institutions like the one that she works for currently. But I think that all of us need to know what those channels are, right? And so maybe for any other people who are listening to this, like, hey, if you know of channels where people can get involved, right, and have their voice heard, then please, like, share it. Because I think, to your point, Ashish, this should be a collective commons build in a lot of ways, right? Rather than the build of the few. And that's the only way we're going to get to, global code.
Yep. And I would like to point out again is that it is not optional. I mean, I feel like we say these statements and still kind of make people feel like it's optional, but it's not. So you better get involved.
It's not optional. And then also that the public should not be made to feel like they are on the receiving end of all the things that are going to go wrong with this thing. You know what I mean? Like, we're sort of sitting back here waiting for the technology to happen to us, like I was saying in another episode. But really, at the end of the day, like, we got to make sure, all of us collectively, that it's not just happening to us, and it takes us where we all want to go, hopefully. Woo!
Another good one. Another great one in the books.
Big dreams, my folks. Big dreams. But according to Ashish, not just a dream, a reality. This is a reality we all need to get on board with. Thank you all for listening, for coming on, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. And I'm looking forward to talking with my co-hosts and our next guest.
Sounds great.
Right.
Take care, everyone.
Y'all.